as a leader, when you start to feel these tensions in your community and the disruption that's happening from current events, the temptation is to go towards a management mindset, which is to return things to peace, to return things to the status quo, to return things to predictability and stability. But leadership looks at it, a leadership lens looks at it very differently, and it says, what is needed in this moment? What do we need to do in this moment? What can we do with this moment? So you're looking at the moment itself, and that involves the values of your community, the purposes that the community has, and the unmet needs that the community has as well. I love that you then went out to the community and you just were vulnerable, and you didn't say, hey, is anybody out here feeling this way? You said, I'm feeling this way. So you just validated for anybody else that if they're feeling that way, you can jump into this conversation. And then you let them jump in and say, yes, me too, right? Now, sometimes you don't feel it yourself, but if you've been a human being before, it doesn't take very much to stop and say, I bet other people are feeling something right now. Even if I'm not feeling it, I bet other people are feeling something right now. And so you could still go out to the community and say, I was sitting and thinking about this, and the thought crossed my mind that some of us, not some of you, but some of us in this community, we might be having an experience with this, even if we weren't there.
So I'm recording this on September 17th of 2025, a week after the horrific murder of Charlie Kirk on UVU campus here in my county, Utah County, in Orem, Utah. And man, emotion that came from this, the tragedy, the stress, the trauma that everybody experienced maybe on different levels. And I tell the story in this recording that you're about to hear about how we approached it as an elders quorum, and maybe some things to consider as there's tragedy that happens in our community, in our nation, where there's heaviness or there's hurt happening, there's anger, there's sadness, there's all types of emotions. How do we handle that at church? What do we do with that at church? Do we ignore it and just get to the lesson and talk about, the doctrine and Jesus Christ and these things and pretend like it didn't happen? Or is there a way we can actually stimulate unity in our word, stimulate healing, stimulate connection that maybe isn't as easy to do when all is well in the world, right? So Dan Duckworth joined me in the Zion Lab community where we just had a discussion about this. Me and him dialogued back and forth. We took some questions and thoughts, and of course, we're not experts at any of this. However, there's so many leadership principles to understand in this to really, again, stimulate that connection and unity and to lead in those moments of hurt and those moments of anger and frustration and discord. There's so many places to lean in here, even when it's risky or it may not go well, or how do I do that, right? So we go through that. I think church has such a higher purpose than just going to a place with your neighbors and learning about the gospel. Like, yeah, that's important, and of course the renewing of ordinances and all that sacred process is crucial. But I think there's a higher level of why we go to church, and I think it's these tragedies that we experience in our communities, in our society, can teach us a lot about what church is really for and why do we go to church, especially when we hurt. And so I hope this discussion is not only helpful for this current event, this current tragedy, but also for future tragedies and that we may experience, a mortality that may hit our community, whether it's a death in the ward, a suicide, something happening that just brings trauma to the ward. How do we handle that well and make it a healing place at church? So here's my discussion in a live stream with Dan Duckworth. Let's jump into it, Dan. I guess the story behind this is, where did it start? You had mentioned something. We were just kind of going back and forth about what we're hearing about, the Sunday experience in different wards. Some had just maybe read a statement over or reiterated the church's statements that they released from their communications department. Just read that to kind of again emphasize the stand of the church and the institutional church. And I had mentioned, well, actually, I'm going to make it the main focus of my elders quorum, and so that started a discussion. But I mean, how do we build some framing around this? What comes to mind?
Yeah, what comes to my mind is there's always this constant tension between what is an institutional response versus what is a leadership response.
Hmm.
When there is a crisis or a tragedy or something like that. And I think that we as a church culture, we've been kind of conditioned to look to the institution to tell us how we should approach a situation like this, whether it's a natural disaster or
Yeah.
a political tragedy or something like that. We're
Or really
looking,
any situation, right? Even the everyday situations, we look to the
right,
institutional church. Yeah.
right. And I think for me, the core always comes down to that a leader intuits the next move from the moment itself. Now, when I say that, that's going to sound a little bit abstract for people, but the question is always as a leader. So not a called leader. Maybe you're a Relief Society president, maybe you're an Elders Quorum president, maybe you're a bishop, maybe you're not. But if you show up in the situation and you feel a call saying something needs to happen here, there's something going on, and if we just let the status quo hold, or if we let inertia take us where it's going to take us, it's not going to lead us to where we want to go. We're not going to get the outcomes and the results that we need. And by results, mostly what I mean is the unification of the community, the Zion moment that we can talk about here on Zion Lab. So as a leader, when you start to feel these tensions in your community and the disruption that's happening from current events, the temptation is to go towards a management mindset, which is to return things to peace, to return things to the status quo, to return things to predictability and stability. But leadership looks at it, a leadership lens looks at it very differently. And it says, what is needed in this moment? What do we need to do in this moment? What can we do with this moment? So you're looking at the moment itself, and that involves the values of your community, the purposes that the community has, and the unmet needs that the community has as well. So what would happen for a group here in Utah County where the tragedy struck might be different than what's needed somewhere else, right? So there's not a one size fits all, but there is something that has to be intuited from this. And Kurt, this is where kind of your response comes into play here, because you felt something calling to you in the moment, saying something more was needed than whatever you had planned initially for Elders Quorum.
Yeah. Yeah, and really, that the one size fits all dream, like it's not going to happen, and that's the only way that any institution can respond is like, here's our one size fits all. Like, I hope it works, or it's very vague, right? And again, that's not the fault of the institution; it's the nature of an institution, right? That there's things locally that we can perceive or intuit, like you say. That the institutional organization may not pick up on or even know to respond to. So in my experience, obviously terrible tragedy at UVU with Charlie Kirk and his murder there in front of thousands of individuals, and here we are just down the street, essentially less than 10 miles away. And I just noticed for myself, like it just really took me out. Right. And it's easy to think like, oh, that just must be me, or it was just little nuances. Like I felt like I couldn't really focus. I wasn't getting a lot done in my typical day. And so I'm the Elders Quorum president, just to put it, if people don't know that piece of context. And so we have a group me text thread in our Elders Quorum, and so I just put a message in there. Said this was the next day at in the morning, 9:30 in the morning. I said, after such a national political tragedy happens so close to home, does anyone else find themselves spacing out, distracted, and scrolling way too much? And immediately, just like message after message, yep, yes, yep, thumbs up on the experience. And one guy says, "Oh yeah, I don't even have social media on my phone, but I'm constantly grabbing my wife's phone and scrolling on that." So that was like a huge indicator where I'm like, I'm perceiving something in me. I wonder if it's a community experience more generally, and obviously I was surprised, unfortunately, that it was. And so And then the thought came to me is like, what is church for if we can't create a space as a community to rally together and you know and talk about what's going on and how we're responding to it and how do we bring the savior into all this for the healing. And so anyways, that was sort of
Before,
the moment.
yeah, before you keep going with the
Yeah.
story, I want to just kind of jump on something that you said there. You said I was perceiving something. And I think this is such a critical aspect of leadership that is overlooked by people who are trying to perform leadership in terms of roles and expectations. You perceived something first because you perceived it in yourself, right? You said I'm having a very human response to this. Now, it could be that you're having that response because of your own backstory, your
Mhm.
own political beliefs, your own whatever, and it could be that it's not. I love that you then went out to the community and you just were vulnerable. And you didn't say, hey, is anybody out here feeling this way? You said, I'm feeling this way. So you just
Yeah.
validated for anybody else that if they're feeling that way, you can jump into this conversation. You said, I'm feeling this way. And then you let them jump in and say, yes, me too. Right. Now, sometimes you don't feel it yourself, but if you've been a human being before, it doesn't take very much to stop and say, I bet other people are feeling something right now. Even if I'm not feeling it, I bet other people are feeling something right now. And so you could still go out to the community and say, I was sitting and thinking about this, and the thought crossed my mind that some of us, not some of you, but some of us in this community, we might be having an experience with this, even if we weren't there on site. Number one, for those of us who live in Utah, it happened in our neighborhood. Number two, it happened in Mormon land, right? So the whole world is sort of associating this with our church, whether they're saying it or not. That's kind of a low grade thread going on here. Number three, it's just the politics of our time. This is one more among many. So it's kind of stacking, right? So you can go out there and perceive. And then on a scriptural basis, let's just note this kind of leadership is what the scriptural leaders show us.
Hmm.
So when Ammon says to King Lamoni, I perceive that you are troubled in your heart.
Mm. Yeah.
That's exactly what you just modeled, Kurt. And that is the intuition, you can call it whatever you want, but that's the Holy Ghost. Whether the Holy Ghost gave you that thought or it validated that that was a true and good and worthy thought, that is the Holy Ghost with the gift of discernment. Okay. So when we talk about these things, we often think way too much about like, oh, the gift of discernment is deciding who's going to serve in what calling. Now, the gift of discernment, we would use the word perception in today's world. It's the gift of perception. I perceive that there are things happening either in you as an individual or in my community that need to be given a voice.
Yeah. And this is the thing, like if there's any power of inspiration or keys or things happening here, and it doesn't necessarily happen to only those who hold that formal, keys or authority, but I think a lot of leaders, even in or outside of formal callings, they've had this experience where they're like, man, I just can't get that person out of my mind, right? And I don't necessarily have a clear prompting of I should go visit them or whatever, but no, I'm gonna make an extra effort to reach out or something, and that perception, I think, is at the core of leadership that we really have to be tuned into, where, I don't necessarily think it's always, a clear, direct spiritual prompt as much as, like, you're just in that cadence of, you want to pick up on those things that seem off or not right, you know?
Yeah. So let me give you this is a different story of a different tragedy. So when we first moved into our ward, there was a suicide in the house next to us. A 13-year-old boy
Mm.
took his own life, and apparently we were very deep sleepers because we were not aware of this. The sirens came in the middle of the night, all the stuff, and we slept right through it. And we showed up at church and had no idea what was going on, but immediately I perceived that something was wrong. Just sitting in the congregation, I'm just sitting there going, something feels really off right now. And so I texted a couple of people while I was sitting in that room saying like, hey, did I miss something? Like, what's going on here? And then somebody said, oh, there was a suicide, and it was so and so, who doesn't actually live next door to us, but his grandpa does. And so then, I found out that it was at the house next door that it happened. And so now I'm sitting there in that room, and I'm having this really weird experience of knowing that a member of our congregation just took his own life, and that his family is at home right now grappling with all of the stuff that comes with that, all of the doubts, all of the fear, all of the anger, all of the sadness, all of that is going on. But we're sitting here in this meeting as fellow saints, and it was never mentioned. Nothing was said. And so I'm having this dissonance inside of me, knowing that there's human tragedy and human suffering in our body. We are the body of Christ. It's happening in our body, and we're pretending and going through the motions, running the show the same way that we would every week. And I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't have a calling. I was a nobody in the ward, and just like everybody else, but I couldn't take it anymore. So in the middle of the sacrament, with the passing of the bread and water, I stood and I walked out, and I walked home, and I knocked on the door, even though I was fairly new and these folks didn't really know me. I just knocked on the door and said, I'm just going to come. I'm just going to be with you. Right. And blessings were given, and prayers were shared, and tears were all the things. Right. So I just share that as a context of this same exact thing we're talking about, where a tragedy strikes and it's felt in the body of the community. And then what do we do with that when we're in what is a fairly scripted and performative experience, like our normal Sunday church services?
Yeah. And I guess like a very normal experience as we perceive these things and then attempt to take action or do something is suddenly we realize there's a risk in this, right? What if I show up to the house and they're like not there? Like maybe I shouldn't even bother. Or what if I make it more uncomfortable? Or what if they don't want me there? Or I was going through this experience going back to my story of like, wow, I don't know if I'm prepared to do this. I don't know if I can bring this up in elders quorum. Maybe we'll just go back to the conference talk and, we'll mention it and make sure everybody knows to reach out to somebody, maybe a therapist they need. Right. And so there is this moment where you kind of sit in the risk of it, or you're unsure, uh, if, if I could do this, and, and that's where I kind of, and I must admit, like I've done a lot of public speaking, very comfortable in front of a crowd, very comfortable facilitating activities and discussion, and I literally facilitate discussion for a living, right? And so I wasn't like um, totally, afraid of it. However, I thought, what resources could I get? So, and most wards have at least one therapist in it, right? So I
Mm,
reached out to this individual
mm,
who's a therapist, and I just said, "Hey, this is what I'm perceiving." I explained it to him, and he's like, "You're exactly right." I talked to another therapist friend, not in my ward, but he said, "From the moment that tragedy happened, the rest of my days, all my sessions were about that one event." And I'm like, "Okay, like something, obviously, it's confirming to me of that perception." And and so, and it was interesting just how he said, "Is like I've never." I keep going back to like, why is this impacting me so much, right? And I kept hearing that from people I talked about. Why is this impacting me so much? And so having that, considering my resources, I thought, okay, maybe with his help, he can be my wingman, or I can be his, and maybe we can facilitate a discussion. And I kept going back to this question of why do we go to church? Like, yeah, we need to take the sacrament. Yes, we need to renew covenants. Yes, we need like the instruction of doctrine. But a big part in all the handbooks is this community component and unity. And this is a great opportunity to really lean into that.
yeah. And before we dive in more to what you did, I wonder if we can bring the audience here, since we have such a great large audience with us today. I'm wondering if we can bring them along in the story. Wondering if you, whether you had a called leadership position or not, if you were perceiving, not just for yourself, but perceiving for your community, if you were having thoughts about what does this mean for us as a community, and how how do we respond to this, and what potential suffering or confusion or anger or apathy might be being experienced within our body as you were approaching your Sunday services? Or maybe you came with a sense of expectation or hope, like I hope nobody talks about this, or I really hope this comes up, or something along those lines. If you can throw something into the chat, we'll bring some of that in here.
Yeah. And feel free to use that hand raise button and I'll keep an eye on that. And there is, Ricky brings us up this dynamic of, it wasn't just like a murder, but it was a political assassination, right? It was heavy in the politics scene. That's sort of the big red card we avoid, in a church setting. We can't go there, right? And there's sort of this fear of like, well, what if it turns political, right? And we don't want to try and navigate that in church meeting. But
Well, and that's interesting because we do, there's things that you're not allowed to talk about, which is politics and religion, right? And when those two things combine, then it's like combustion. It's just like, oh, this is going to spin out of hand very, very quickly. Now, part of intuiting the moment is also intuiting what you personally are ready to handle as a leader in a moment. Because I want you to think about an analogy for a quick second. When metal needs to be melted, so first of all, I'll say it this way: when metal needs to be reshaped, it has to first be melted, or at least softened. The only way to do that is for it to go into the fire. Now, the problem with putting metal into fire is that it's going to get contaminated or lost into the ashes and the coal of the fire. So it has to have a container that allows it to be in the container and still go into the fire to be melted and purified so that it can be reshaped. Now, that container is the crucible. We often talk about a crucible as though it's the fire itself, it's the heat itself, but it's not. The crucible is the container that allows the metal to go into the fire and to be purified and reshaped. Now, as a leader, what your role is in any of these similar situations that we're talking about is you have to create that holding container for the people where they can go into the fire. The temptation is to say, oh, it's hot. There's danger in that fire. So we do not want the people to go there. And then, as I think I and others often say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste as a leader. You don't want the crisis, you don't want the tragedy, but when it comes, it brings the necessary heat for the refinement of the community. And it's a terrible thing to waste. So instead of running from the fire, what we as leaders do is we help create that container for us to go into that fire. Now, what these moments reveal about your communities, whether it's your quorum or your relief society or your ward or your stake or your council or your family or your neighborhood or your nation, what these kind of moments reveal is the fractures. They reveal the fault lines. So we've gone on through times of peace, convincing ourselves that we're united, that we're together. But the truth of the matter is, as soon as these moments come, it reveals that we're not. And so that's why it feels dangerous to go into these sessions, is because it will expose that we're not together, and it might actually break us further apart. But the irony is that only by going into the fire together can we heal and seal up those fractures that exist in the community. You want to talk about one heart and one mind. You don't get there unless you go through struggle and conflict and difficulty and crisis together. And you have to navigate that together. And so if the tragedy was in your ward or in your neighborhood or in your nation, but it affects your group, you need to go, the leader needs to take people in there in a way that they can pass through it safe enough to not lose themselves, but hot enough to remake the community.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's, if there's anything you learn or perceive from this experience, even if it wasn't talked about, you know, why or why, what was the fear in that, right? Heidi mentions here, I didn't really want it mentioned. We have some very strong opinions on either side of the political aisle, and our board does not have those kind of relationships to speak to that, right? I think that's a fair statement, and you're not alone in that perception, right? That the typical Sunday where we just show up and smile and shake hands and talk about the law of the tithing and let's go to DNC, whatever. Like, yeah, we can be decent people to one another, right? But some of these areas we avoid, and that's a good indicator. And I'm self-aware enough to recognize I'm in Utah County, the one of the most deepest red conservative counties in the nation. And so, yeah, was there less risk of me bringing this up and us being at odds? Sure. I mean, I'm sure a DC ward it's gonna be a different experience. However, it's still worth leaning into that, in my opinion. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I'm gonna bring up something else now too, Kurt, because what you just described was the idea that within your group there might have been some unanimity, some conformity around political beliefs or things like that. And so it's really easy during times of tragedy or crisis like this. What we do is we fragment, but that fragmentation, once you're in your group, we now retreat into that smaller, more localized, more conformed mindset. And so that retreating into that group is also part of the problem. We allow the tragedy to say, oh, well, that's their problem. At least we've got it figured out in our neighborhood. And instead, what that's doing is it's actually, the fault lines might not be within our group, but they're around our group. So it's actually pulling us further away from this bigger thing that we belong to. First of all, we belong to, you belong to the state, you belong to the religion, you belong to the nation, and you belong to the humanity, to the family of God. But as we retreat into what feels comfortable, and that could be at the quorum level, or it could be at your family level around the kitchen table, it's very easy to start to other and to point outward and to say like, oh yeah, it's, but at least we, right? And so that's more work that needs to be done. Is if that's your group, you come and you say, hey, there are people out there. You might not be suffering from this, or you might be having one reaction to this, but there are other people out there who are probably, who in this case, definitely are having an opposing reaction or a differing reaction that is just as legitimate as yours in terms of the humanity of the experience. I'm not talking about political ideology.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the humanity of what people are going through at a time like this.
Yeah, and that humanity really is at the core. Like, how do we go to that point? We're not saying we're not going to a political point, we're going to humanity point. Regardless of what happened, it may impact people differently, right? And this obviously this is a very specific, heavy, experience, right? That happened. But there could be even other things that maybe to me don't seem like a catastrophe, but others are responding to it maybe more negatively. And so this is where that perception comes in place. Again, not that it always has to be a, church, second hour discussion or sacramenting topic, but again, you're always perceiving this where you're trying to say where's the harm, where's the hurt, and how can we show up and step into that, So
yeah, and to that point, I mean, so first of all, I've never even heard of Charlie Kirk before this last week. Never heard of him, never heard of his movement, never heard of his style, never heard of his politics. It shows you a little bit about how I sort of keep myself out of a lot of the political stuff because I'm not on social media. That's what my kids have all told me. Well, if you were on social media, regardless of your politics, you would know who he is. Okay, well, fair enough. I'm not on social media. But this similar experience happened in someone's home, right? This Democratic couple, I think it was Minnesota or Wisconsin, which again shows you I'm not that tapped in, right?
Yeah, Minnesota, I believe.
Minnesota.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
so
Wisconsin. Yeah, anyways.
that tragedy may not have struck the conservative crowd because it wasn't their standard bearer. But that tragedy most likely struck the liberal crowd if they identified with those people. But it should strike all of us because of the humanity and the national implications of, well, what does it mean if you can express an idea and then someone walks in your house and shoots you for it? Or what does it mean if you express an idea and you stand in front of a crowd and someone shoots you for it? That's a different story than the story that we've all grown up and lived in. That's a story that's lived by a lot of our fellow saints around the world, right? I've got a guy in my stake here, and I'm going to forget his home country, but it's somewhere in Latin America. And he was a bishop in his area, and he was a store owner and was a successful store owner. And he was being followed home one night And by the time he got home, his house had been overtaken by robbers, by thieves, and they basically took everything from the house at gunpoint and said, if you ever turn us in, we'll kill you all. And he left that night, got his family on a plane and left and came to the United States, right? So people around the world are living under a story like this. But for America, we don't know what it's like to live under this story. And just like 9/11 rocked our story, 24 years ago, these events are now rocking our story. And we're saying, wow, this is not the place I thought I lived, regardless of my political ideology.
Yeah. And those of you, if there's questions that come up or thoughts, feel free to raise your hand or use the comment box, because we're happy to facilitate that. So the principles I'm picking up on, Dan, as we move through this, is that really be aware of that perception. If you're perceiving something's off, like, again, we don't sort of like go whisper to the bishop or text him like, hey, you should do something about this, right? Like, hopefully we feel empowered to lean into those. You told your story, I'm telling mine. Obviously, I'm more in a formal leadership role, but be aware of those perceptions. Recognize that it feels risky, it feels uncertain, right? And oftentimes that's a good indicator of the spirit, is when it's like, that doesn't feel right, but I feel that prompting and that perception, and then lean in, right? And so let's go to Jeff. Do you have something to share?
Kurt, maybe while we're
Yeah.
waiting for Jeff and see if he comes on.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do think it would be great, even though you recognize already your situation here is your situation here in Utah County. I do think it would be really interesting for all of us to hear how you approached it, because I think your approach was very unique in terms of what we typically would see in a Latter-day Saint meeting setting.
Yeah. So yeah, for as far as my approach, what I did, so I just sent out a message in that, I think it was Friday or Saturday. And I just said, hey, just so you know, we're going to do Elders Quorum a little bit differently on Sunday. I can let me pull it up just so I have exactly what I said as I thought through there.
Which, while you're pulling that up, let's just note, Kurt is creating the Crucible, right? And he's managing the temperature of that experience. So just alone by giving them a heads up, you're already helping to regulate the temperature of those who are saying, I don't really want to talk about this. I'm not really sure where this is going to go. You're already letting them know we're not going to surprise anybody.
Yeah.
And probably gave them a little bit of a context of what that was going to be like.
Yeah. Yeah. So I said, hey, gentlemen, FYI, Sunday, we are not going to focus on conference talks during Elders Quorum. Instead, I'd like to take some time to focus on some teachings of Christ and also create some space to process the heaviness that is happening in our nation and community. Please make arrangements to be there to support one another. I only do things by invitation, so please attend knowing you can participate as little or as much as you'd like. If you are in a separate calling during that time and wish to be with us in Elders Quorum, please let me know and we can make arrangements. And so, yeah, I kind of prepped the audience that was the direction we're going. I don't want to sneak up on anybody or suddenly make them feel uncomfortable. And we had definitely more than the typical attendees there. There's probably 5 to 10 more men in Elders Quorum. And so from there,
why
I
do you
just
think
thought,
that is, Kurt? Why do you think that is, that you had more come as a result of that message?
well, I just think that, just perceiving that everybody was kind of carrying this around, and also just the culture that I feel like we've tried to develop in Elders Quorum. They knew it would be a safe place, right? They knew they know they've had experience of talking about maybe heavier things or difficult topics. And so that safety was hopefully already established in our culture, and knowing that, okay, I'm definitely not going to miss this one. Right. So,
Yeah, I think that there's a temptation to think like, oh, it was salacious, and so they want to come and they want to see they want to see the boxing match come out, right?
Yeah.
I think, as a few of our viewers here have voiced on the chat, like, most people don't want to be part of the boxing match. They don't even really want to witness it either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that if people thought that it was going to be addressed in a combative way, or that it might even come out, there's some people who might even have some anxiety that they're feeling, their own past experiences, or things that they're feeling, they're like, I just don't even want to take the risk of being there, they might not have even showed up at all on a Sunday like that and just said, this is just a Sunday that I don't want to be around these folks.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important that you send this message out, you're regulating the temperature. And it's also important for everyone to realize that there was leadership culture building being done over a period of time. So this is what I mean by perceiving from the moment. So because you had laid groundwork, the moment meant something different for you than it might have otherwise if you hadn't laid that groundwork. And so it's not that anybody could just jump into a meeting and do what you're about to explain that you did. A lot of that was the groundwork. And so what do leaders do during times of peace? They lay a lot of groundwork for moments just like this. And then when the moments come, you're ready because the crucible has been being built and formed all along. It's like, okay, we've got the ship now, we've got the container, and now that the fire is firing, we can now go into it.
Yeah. And putting this in the context of a non-formal leader, like just consider how you're doing that in the relationship you have with others in your community, right? Just those simple moments of stopping by someone's home, simple moments of chatting in the hallway, like you're building this relationship so they know this is a safe person to talk with. When tragedy strikes, I can reach out to this person, just to kind of making it more universal that way. But and the other thing, I think the component to a lot of people worry about is like, well, we need this is professional business. Like what if I make this worse? What if I say the wrong thing? I should get a team of therapists in here. And that's, kind of where I went, where I think obviously the therapy and that industry knows a lot more about maybe how to facilitate talking about tragedy. And that's why I did reach out to that therapist. However, he had something come up, a family event that he was not able to be there, so I was back alone. But when I go back, especially to my interviews with Stephen Shields, if you haven't listened to those, I highly recommend them. But he always talks about this concept of like what's the church leader's role, and he always says your role is to drive the hope train, right? You just bring as much hope into that meeting as possible, and then if they need additional, professional services and things, yeah, we'll get there and we'll direct them to those paths. But there's still a vital role of that leader of driving the hope train. And so I knew in order to step into that room, I wanted to have discussion. I wanted to create a place where if people needed to decompress from the tension of the experience, they could do that. But I always knew that I was always going to bring it back to a strong story of Jesus Christ and how he showed up, how he healed in moments of tragedy. And so I started that meeting with just, and you always have to warm up any setting, right? And so we just talked about, and I got some of this content from the therapist in my ward, but talking about just different emotions that you may experience. And and a lot of times we go to secondary emotions, right? I'm mad, I'm happy, I'm sad, right? But well, why are you sad? Oh, that's because I'm hurt, or that's because I'm in shock, right? And so I just create a moment for the elders to kind of just process in their mind. Because here's the thing, like obviously the sacrament and sacrament meetings a great place to process at times, but I knew that the vast majority of these men were sitting with their young families, coloring pictures or telling them to sit down, or right. So oftentimes they don't get that chance to really decompress effectively in sacrament meeting. So I wanted to just create 5 to 10 minutes where we could do that, right? So I had them sit. I gave them note cards just right. I said, put 1, 2, 3 emotions down that have been dominant this last week since the tragedy happened, right? So that took place, and then I just asked, would anybody be willing to speak to that? What was that like? What did you feel, right? And then it snowballs, right? One person raises their hand, talks about it. Next person does. We had men that you could see they were visibly angry, right? Again, not anybody in the room, but they just were in that stage of anger. And but by the time they're done with their comment, you kind of see that it was a little bit less angry, right? One or two kind of broke down in tears about what was happening, and that you could feel the unity build around those individuals. And then I went into almost a sermon about Christ and the Jairus' daughter. I always say his name wrong, but and the woman with that's the blood disease, and how that was a pivotal moment a moment of emergency. This daughter's dying. We've got to be there. And just how patient Christ was and all of that. Anyways, and so definitely sort of creating that space to have that conversation, decompress, share what you're feeling. And it wasn't that there was no coaching going on, like, oh, well, maybe you should try this, or have you thought about that? Or when I feel that this way, this is what I do. It was just like, we just want to hear you, right? And so then I went into the story of Christ, and then this is something we do every elders quorum, which again laid the foundation of this cultural safety. Is we always end in a circle of trust. I have the men stand up. We get in a big circle. There's probably 35 to 40 men, and we ask if there's anything specific that we can pray for those men. And it was those individuals who made comments that were more emotional. I just said, "Hey, brother Joe, like, how can we pray for you?" Right? And he'd already sort of leaned into that, and he was much more open to asking for support that way. And then we asked someone in the chord to pray, and man, just so many individuals coming up to me after, like, that said nothing, and the whole meeting said, "I really needed this week. Thank you for doing that." Right? And again, I recognize it could have gone sideways. There could have been argument. There could have been so many places gone wrong, but I'd rather that happen than pretend like, oh, let's just open up a conference talk and pretend like nothing happened, right? So anyways, any thoughts come to mind, Dan?
Yeah, well, why was it worth the risk to do that? Like, you knew it could go sideways and it could become something hard to control and contain. Like, why was that worth the risk to you?
Oh man, I mean, I could feel healing happening in the room, right? Not that I was offering it or doing it, but just inviting the Savior into that tragedy, rather than just looking for updates on a on a phone or in social media. And that's the unity component, right? Like, this is the often asked question when it comes to ward culture or quorum culture or relief society culture. Like, what do we got to do to stimulate unity? We need to be more unified. And we always go to, let's have a pizza party. We'll just get together. We'll get to know each other. Then three guys show up, and right, it's got to be every core meeting experience, right? Where you are stimulating like authenticity, vulnerability, because it's that, I always go back to the scripture. This is both said in the Book of Mormon and the Bible, of Christ hung on a cross to draw men to him, like to draw all men to him, right? That it was the moment of the peak of vulnerability that drew people to him. So it is in that practice of vulnerability where we can draw people together, and that just creates more strength. And to me, that is why we go to church.
Well, so let's press that a little bit,
Yeah.
because I think a common when people hear that you're doing stuff like this in elders quorum, a common retort is, "Hey, this isn't group therapy.
Hmm.
We're here to learn the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're not here to, cry on each other's shoulders and sing kumbaya together." So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not group therapy, right? And that's why the focus, the pinnacle, was the story of Jesus. Like, it was his healing that was talked about. What is the redemption he offers us, right? And so, um, I just don't know why we go to church. Like, if we go to church to learn things, well, I can go on YouTube and learn things. If we go to church to participate in ordinances, great. That took 10 minutes. So I just feel like if we're so focused and structured on a church of community, uh, there's purpose in that community. There should be healing in that community. And everybody felt redeemed after that experience because it was a community experience focused on Christ.
I'm trying to look up right now. I'm going to the handbook and I'm using the new AI assistant,
Could be
'cause
dangerous, Dan.
there's some specific language around what the purpose of elders quorum is, and it's
Oh
actually the
yeah,
exact same language, not the exact, but almost the exact same language as it is for the Relief Society.
yeah.
Okay, so it says the purpose of the elders quorum is to strengthen faith, build unity, and support families and homes. That's the purpose, the stated purpose of the elders quorum is to strengthen faith, build unity, and support families and homes. How is what you did fulfilling that purpose?
Well, of course, I hope it's fulfilling that purpose, but I think when you model something like that, going back to the strengthening homes, that father hopefully can go home and do something similar, right? And start a conversation and ask for prayer and pray together and those types of things. So, and the unity, just like I said, like the a vulnerable experience unifies people. Um, and then what was the other one in there?
Strengthen faith, build unity, support families and homes.
Yeah, and strength and faith. I mean, to me, I wanted to model this is in this crucible experience. This is how we rely on Jesus Christ. We're not just like uh, spouting things, platitudes at church because that's just what we say, right? This is actually what it looks like is we turn to the story of Jesus and remind him how he showed up for people there, that he's willing to do that for us. And is he, right? And inviting them to lean into that. Um, so yeah, that's what comes to mind.
I think a little analogy too that goes along with that is when we think of church, if you use a sports analogy, you have the practices and you have the games. And I think that we often think of church as being like the practices, right? It's not the real game. We're going to step out of the real world. We're going to take a minute. We're going to kind of think through, get ourselves ready. We're going to send you guys back out into the real world. That's one approach, and it's valid in some ways. But another approach is to say church is about living the real thing together. And are we living life together as we're sitting in the pews? Are we living life together as we're in our Relief Society or Young Women's or priesthood core meetings? Are we living life together? And I think that's what becomes so damaging sometimes to the body is when we show up and pretend, when something is affecting the body and we show up and pretend that it's not because we're locked into the performance of so-and-so had a lesson planned and we don't want to interrupt that lesson that they prepared for. You know what I mean? And so we get locked into that performance and into the script,
Yeah.
and we ignore what's really happening within the body. We're no longer living together. And so as a practice, we become hypocritical. If you're going to sit in a room and ignore the reality of what people are experiencing, it's now a hypocritical experience, or what I call a plastic experience. And that can happen as a group going through a shared tragedy like the one that we're talking about as a nation here. Um, but it can also happen if people are suffering individually. Like if they're showing up and they're having one experience and it's not honored, named, validated, expressed, seen, heard, touched, all the things in that setting. In other words, they're having to show up and be fake in that setting. They now have to, what's called alienation. They have to alienate themselves. They're fragmenting internally. They have to start to silence the parts of themselves that don't belong here in this space. So now all of a sudden people are showing up at church, and the travesty in all of this is when our youth experience this. When they show up to church and they can't have their real lived experience at church. And that's where they learn to perform a certain role, a certain expectation, a certain language, a certain attitude at church versus what the lived experience is. And it's no wonder that over time, those begin to separate to the point where you either have to deny your own lived experience and bury that and tuck that deep down inside of you. And that might be from trauma, or it just might even be like a call that you feel inside, or a way that you see the world through your own experiences. You have to tuck that down deep inside so that you can continue to perform, or you have to shed the performance so that you can lean into this, which generally means leaving the church and saying, I can no longer be here because I can't be what I've become in myself. I can't be here. Whereas what Jesus in the scriptures is repeatedly saying is bring those together. That vulnerability that you talked about, that authenticity, like bring those together as leaders. And that's a formal leader standing up, leading the meeting, or it's I'm sitting in this room and I can sense the inauthenticity of what we're experiencing. And I'm going to step into the breach. I'm going to be the person that gives the real experience in this room that nobody's asking for and that might shock everybody. And I have no idea if I'll be hurt by doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, And this is I guess I'll go to this question here. Rick asks, how do you unify an entire ward who is feeling disconnected or a stake? How do you move the whole organization and not just a quorum or class? I have some thoughts, but what comes to mind for you, Dan?
Well, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I guess to me, this is like, who says you have to change? Like, if we enter different, different contexts all the time where there's no unity, right? But this is where we can step in and be that catalyst of that change, right? Where, um, let's say, okay, this is a cute story, Kurt. You're the Elders Quorum president. You have this experience, or I can't do that. I don't get to determine what happens in the second hour, right? Well, you can invite people over to your home. You could, reach out to people, like, walk over to the home, knock on their house, and say, are you feeling off like me? Right. This is where I'm at. Where are you at? Right. And it's I wish it was easy or had the 5-step plan, but it's that, going back to the principle of it, was looking for those perceptions that you're feeling and leaning into that prayerfully and saying, all right, I'm going to act like, what do I need to do? Right. And it doesn't always go great, but this is like the constant struggle of stimulating culture, is that it's messy and it doesn't make sense, but we can't sit in the back, fold our arms, and say, well, if the bishop just got on board, he could fix this, or if the elders quorum president just did what Kurt did, then it'd be great. Like, no, there's a lot that we have way more power than we think we do. And I would say, I don't know if it's necessarily your job to shift that culture. You can be as catalyst as much as you can, but we can't grade ourselves on, my ward's not that unified. Like, well, go find a group in your ward and unify that, right? So it's a tough question. Anybody else have a thought, question, want to speak to anything? You can disagree with us. Again, we're just two guys, but we're open to that. Steve, go ahead. We don't hear you, Steve.
I know there was someone speaking when I first jumped on, so it's not
I know it's working.
Not a settings issue.
Yeah.
Just to kind of speak to what you just brought up there on the topic of how do you unify a whole ward or stake. I guess what I'm feeling in that question, which may or may be right, is you're not the bishop or you're not the stake president.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm just wondering, the church has supplied us with circles. Why do you do circles? And as I say that, let me throw in the proviso that there's 100 and plus elders quorum members in our ward, and we've got 30 that are signed up on circles.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I think you just answered the question.
Yeah, exactly. I think the church made an attempt at having some type of group chat, but it hasn't overcome the other better options. So that's why we use GroupMe. Not that GroupMe is the best, but some use Slack, or what's the other one? Anyways, but yeah, whatever gets the job done, or some just do a big text thread. So
when it just comes back down to the principle of reading the moment, reading the situation. So if you're a leader who says, I just do whatever the institution tells me to do on everything, including what app to use for communication, then you're going to be restricted to communicating with the 20% of your ward that's willing to use circles. Or if you're a leader who says, I'm going to go to where the people are, I'm going to gather them in a way that they'll gather, then you're going to get a lot higher hit rate with your communication. So that's just something everybody has to work out for themselves of how they want to approach that. Back on the other idea of unifying a ward or stake, and I can see maybe Ricky is typing in, but assuming that you're not a bishop or a stake president, because you have completely and wildly different levers as a bishop, it looks like you were at one point, or as a stake president. When you are the authorized institutional leader, you have levers that you can pull that nobody else can pull, not even your counselors, just because people orient you differently. It has nothing really to do with your formal authority per se. It's just the way you're perceived in the community. So a bishop can say something and get a very different response than if someone else were to say the exact same thing. So as someone who's not the bishop or a stake president who's trying to make change in an organization that you don't have authority over, you have to recognize that authority and legitimacy are two different things. So anyone who holds authority ultimately has to earn legitimacy. They can lose legitimacy that comes with their office. But legitimacy is not granted by the institution. Stake president doesn't give the bishop legitimacy. The legitimacy comes through the relationship and the trust that you build with the people. So Kurt was describing a situation where he said, I think given the things that we've done in the past, they assumed it was going to be a safe and controlled environment and that I was going to do well with this. That's because he earned legitimacy through his previous actions. Legitimacy is earned, though, not necessarily through what you do, but through how you're perceived by the community. So if you don't have legitimacy in the ward as a spokesperson who can speak for the community, I'm not saying speaking for the ward as a institution, I'm saying speaking for the ward as a community. If you don't have that legitimacy, you will approach the situation very differently. And there's a whole lot to say here. That's why I'm kind of stuttering over this. I don't want to get too deep, but it basically comes down to this: your work as a leader is to disrupt the status quo. And that's what leadership is. Leadership is creating power in the moment through transformative action. So you do the thing that needs to be done that nobody else is willing to do. And through that action, you will start to earn legitimacy from the people, because they will say, oh, you're willing to bear a cost to do the right thing, to do the thing we all wish we could do. And that's why it becomes legitimate. We all wish this would happen. We all wish this ward was united. We all wish this thing could be said. We all wish blah, blah, blah. And you were willing to do what I wasn't willing to do because there was a cost involved. And so now I start to attach legitimacy to that. If there's no cost involved, I perceive you as rogue, as self-interested, as dangerous, as whatever. But if there's cost involved, I now know, dude, you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing this for us. You're doing this for the we. And here's why there can never be a how-to. And this is the problem with the leadership industry as it exists today. It's so focused on telling leaders how to show up and what to do to solve all these problems. And it's that right from the get-go is built on a lie. It cannot come down to that. It always has to come down to a leader in the moment, reading the moment. And that moment includes who you are, the legitimacy you do or you don't hold, the talents that you do and you don't have. Kurt said he's good with public speaking. If you're not good with public speaking, you're going to approach the situation very differently. You might actually pull in somebody else and say, I'd like you to lead this conversation. So you're constantly looking towards the moment and all of the factors, all of the materials, all of the strengths and the weaknesses and all that's built in to that moment. And then your intuition, confirmed by the Holy Ghost, is going to lead you to that one thing that you can do. It will feel risky, because if it's not risky, it's not leadership. It will feel risky, but the temperature won't be so hot that it feels like it's going to destroy you if it goes wrong.
Yeah. And on that note, like, when it comes to like the institutional church, because as I'm out and about or in different meetings and more private settings, like the most common question or the most typical discussion I have with individuals who meet me and have like a private moment with me, they can ask me a direct question. They know that, again, we're Leading States is independent with the church, though we work with the church and have great communication with the church. So they know I'm kind of aware of things, maybe more inside the church than the average member. And they always go to this place of like, okay, when is the institutional church going to do this, more training? When are they going to release this? When are they going to change this program? When are they going to fix that? Right. And just what Dan said, that legitimacy, like, or with that, we want the plan. When are they going to send the plan to us that we can execute? And the gnarly thing about leadership is that, like Dan said, there's no plan. Like the institutional church it's impossible for them to give a plan, generally speaking, other than just general policies and guidelines that way. But they can't give you a plan about how to stimulate culture or give you a plan of how to perceive things in your ward. That's where you have to feel that enabling power on yourself and saying, "Oh, that's because I'm the leader, and I have to perceive these things and take action." Am I in bounds there, Dan?
Absolutely. And, just along those lines, the church did put out a formal statement,
Mm-hmm.
and the same statement that we all would have guessed that they would have written, because what else can you write when you are the head of 18 million people across 100 and whatever number of countries? What else can you write other than we condemn this act and we sue for peace and we, ask, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the interesting thing, and I wish I had the quote brought up right now, but their statement ended with an appeal to build communities of some kind, peaceful communities. I can't remember what it was. If somebody has it, they can throw it in the chat. But that is a license to the real leaders among us. It's not a license to those people who don't even have the first concept of what a Zion community is. And there are many bishops and Relief Society presidents and Elders Quorum presidents and stake presidents who don't really have the first conception of what Zion is. A people who are united in one heart and one mind. But if you are a Zion builder, because God has put in your heart a vision of what it means to have a Zion family or a Zion ward or a Zion team at work or a Zion classroom at school or a Zion whatever that you're part of. If God has put that vision on your heart, then you are a Zion builder. And so when you hear the prophet of the Lord say, we call on you to bring forth communities. I wish I had the exact quote. I was hoping somebody put it in there. Oh, here we go. Okay, we call upon people everywhere to build communities of greater kindness and love. Zion people. This is the prophet without saying the word Zion. He's saying, we're calling on you to build Zion in your community. And what I'm saying to you right now is Zion is always a leadership project. And leadership is not something that can be assigned. Management, supervision can be assigned by the institution, but leadership is a force in the world that you exert through the very process we just talked about, stepping into the breach, doing the hard thing, bearing the cost, shaping, creating the crucibles. That's what leadership is. And any one of us can do that. It's just we'll have different levels depending on who we are and the resources that are available to us in the moment.
Yeah, shout out to Carson. Thanks for getting that for us. And I want to go to another comment Carson said. And Carson says, I think there are two concerns to navigate at church here. Managing strong emotions, pain, hurt, anger, etc. in tragedy. Sounds like Kurt did this beautifully. Well, managing highly charged and contentious differences of political opinion in tragedy. This is a common place that people go of like, well, what about the emotional person, the highly charged person, the person that's responding way too much, or the person that overshares, right? And I have to try and flip that around. Like if you're experiencing a tension with somebody oversharing something, it's often something going on in you, not necessarily the person, right? And I get there's maybe outliers of, I'm sure you've all have a story like that, but nonetheless, more often than not, the managing strong emotions, that is the greatest opportunity for the community to signal, you're okay here. You're one of us. And there were some strong emotions, like I mentioned. And the way I responded was, hey, John, like, we hear you, man. We're here for you. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being so willing to talk. Or if I saw people nodding along with their saying, there's lots of heads nodding in here when you were speaking. Thank you. Well, like, we got you, right? And that, again, that stimulates safety. That safety, the more we stimulate that safety, I think the emotions will stay more balanced or regulated that way. And just the highly charged and contentious differences. I mean, this is the question of the century in my mind when it comes to our churches. I know that I think there's more official statements, and this is why I don't sit in red padded chairs during general conference, but we have got to figure out how to talk to one another in the setting of church about these things. I know we default to this place of like, oh no, politics here, we can't talk about it. If I was, if me and my wife had an issue that we just couldn't talk about, no, we can't talk about that. Like, there's a problem with our relationship, right? We need to get help. We need to do something. And this is where the leaders and the Zion builders step up of saying, no, there is a way to talk about this, and we can talk about it and see the humanity in it and connect, and that will unify people. We will never reach the peak of unity until we can do that. And we can never reach Zion until we figure out how to do that. And I get that it's a tough gig or tough row to hoe, And there's no 5-step plan. Like Dan said, we have to perceive these things and lean in even when the risk is present.
Yeah, I love that, Kurt. That is so beautiful. And I think that just a quick note, I think you did lean into number 2, even though Carson was saying you did number 1 really well. You may not have had an environment that would have been as politically charged as a different,
Right.
locale. Like we've already covered that.
Yeah.
But you did set the frame. So number 1, you did set the frame. You said, we're going to talk about this in terms of the stories of Jesus and how he approached these things. And this is, I mean, it's not a guarantee that that's going to bring people down, but that's a one way of saying, like, this is what we're here to talk about. Now, Carson, I would just say, and again, this is not a 5-step plan, but let's just do a thought experiment. If I was in a ward where I wanted to have this conversation, or in a family where I wanted to have this conversation, and there was 1 or 2 people that I knew were highly charged and highly likely to say something that would offend other people and shut down the conversation. They may not argue back. There may not be like getting ready to go to blows, but it may like stifle what we're trying to do here, eliminate that safe space that we need for the number 1 on your list, the strong emotions. I would go to that person first. And I would say, here's what's going to happen in this meeting today. And I would just speak the truth to them. You have a tendency to speak in highly charged, highly political ways. And I know you think you're right. And I know you think that God has asked you to convince every single one of us to see the world the same way that you see it. But that's not what we're coming here to do. So I want to have a conversation with you, first of all, to help you understand what we're coming here to do and to ask you to support that. Now, I want you to know that if you cross the line, I'm going to call you out in front of the group. And I'm going to say, you're crossing a line. I want you to know if you cross it a second time, I'm going to ask you to leave the room. I want you to know if you won't leave the room, I'm going to end Elders Quorum on the spot, and we're all going to leave the room. Now, you do that in private because it gives them a chance to now prepare themselves and to think through those things and to come in the right mindset. But also, you put them on notice. They won't be surprised if you do that in the meeting. And so now, why would you even take that chance, right? If you know that's a possibility in your quorum, why would you even take that chance? For the very reason Kurt just laid out. Because we cannot be one body as long as we have these fractures among us. And tragedy is the only way to forge these cracks back together again. It's like you were mentioning, Kurt, this before, but in the business setting, they often do team building exercises. We're going to go to an escape room. We're going to go do a high ropes course, blah, 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 blah. We're going to build the team. That does almost absolutely nothing for building a cohesive and unified team, because the patterns and the culture and the expectations and the dependencies and the trust of that team is built through the difficult times. And it's only in the difficult times that those can be rewired and reworked. So as a community, or as a leader, you have to be willing to say, it's worth going into this. I'm going to do all that I can to build the crucible, to manage the temperature, but I might lose control of this. If that risk isn't there, it's not disruptive enough to actually do any real work in terms of community building. So I might lose control of this. Someone might say something that offends somebody else. That is a real possibility. So do all that you can think of as you're perceiving to manage that, build the crucible, bring the temperature down, all of those things. But then also just know that that's not necessarily failure, because you've now just created another opportunity to step into that breach. Okay. So say it does blow up on you. Now you have a chance to go have conversations with so-and-so, to have conversations with, so to come back the next time, right? You've now created a real lived experience in which your group is coming together. And then last thing I'll say on this, Kurt, is if you think about the prophecies about the contention that will dominate our world coming into the coming of Jesus Christ, if we cannot learn how to talk about these things together, regardless of our political ideologies, we are not creating Zion, and we are not prepared to exist and survive, let alone thrive as communities in that world that has been prophesied is upon us and will continue to deepen in terms of the contention.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you were speaking there, I'm just thinking like there's a lot of leaders, a lot of wards who try and keep that beach ball under the surface of the water as long as they can. And you can keep pushing it down, holding it there. But the more tragedy, the more mortality puts pressure on that ball, it's going to have to come up and you don't know which direction it's going. So the more of these opportunities you have to kind of release that valve a little bit and unifying people, then you build strength that you can handle anything. Right. And
And I love that.
that's Zion. I appreciate, Carson's candidness here is like, I'm concerned about the minority of the different opinions feeling like they don't belong. The two people in Kurt's class who had different than the majority, they weren't nodding along. They went home wondering if they should go to church again. Did that happen? Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe
Right. But
Carson knows somebody in your quorum.
yeah. Hey, it's Carson. He's in my quorum. No. But the point being, we weren't like pushing like, oh, we're all angry, so let's all be angry, right? But what we were doing is witnessing the hurt in the room. And so most likely when that person feels hurt at some point, they can say, well, that can be witnessed here, right? I'm not saying I nailed it. I'm not saying I pitched a perfect game by any means, but this effort is worth the effort rather than everybody just telling mission stories as we talk about conference talks, and then we go home and wonder why we even hang out with those people. So
Yeah, and I think if that was a real concern that you had, Kurt, you could follow up with a message to the group me, and you could say, I recognize that some of you might not have experienced that the same way that I did, and it might have been hard for you. And so I would like to invite you to please reach out to me and share with me if that experience was different for you than what I might have thought it was.
yeah,
And again, you don't treat it like a one and done. You treat it like this is a journey that we're on together. And the more that I can understand you and the more you can understand me, the more we're going to find where we are human together. And that will become, that's the thing about Zion, folks. Ideology and even doctrine is not the basis of a Zion community. It is our shared togetherness as children of God. When you base a community off of our shared identity and our shared nature as children of God, Zion flourishes. And we have to strip back. I know it's hard to say in this setting, but we even have to strip back the religious ideology. Jesus met people where they were. He created Zion with them in a moment, not because of what they believed about him. He just saw their humanity. He let them see his humanity. And in that moment, Zion was created, and that became the basis for everything they did together. Doesn't mean there's not a role for doctrine. It doesn't mean I'm challenging the doctrine or saying it's not true or the handbook's not, whatever, etc. I'm just saying if you want to have that kind of Zion experience that we've been called to build, you've got to learn how to bring the group to that core shared identity. It is the only thing in these latter days that we will fundamentally share together is our humanity, which, by the way, when I say humanity, I mean our divinity as children of God.
right. Yeah, that's good. And there's so many layers to this, like maybe there were one or two who felt like, man, I'm the outlier here, that my opinions are different. I would probably guess 90% of the elders in that room, I have sat in their home one-on-one visiting with them. Right. So there's an effort of establishing a relationship that I hope that if they feel that way, they're willing to reach out, or they know that I'll be in their home at some point again. Right. And so there's so many layers of culture building that to take into consideration here, but I think it was just well worth the effort of leaning into that, even though it could have gone sideways, or even though I could have offended one or two, or I think it was well worth the effort. So, Dan, any final encouragement as we sign off?
I think why are we doing this today, right? Like we're doing this because at Leading Saints, we have a sense of purpose and mission that we're trying to help leaders who have the Zion vision, who have the Zion mindset in their heart. We're trying to help them see how this looks in the real world. And so when we were feeling this tension for our own wards and quorums and stakes, and when Kurt was leaning into this with the opportunity that he had, I didn't get a chance to talk about some of the things that we did here, but we'll save that for a different day. We're sharing them not as the prescription. We're sharing them to open the mindset and to say, look at these experiences, look at these moments, look at these opportunities with a different lens on, not the lens of the standard and the script and the performance and what's the right thing to do in the institutional sense. The lens of, if we were Zion, what would we do? Or if I was trying to build Zion in a moment, what would I do? And I think that perception, that spirit of discernment, we have access to the Holy Ghost, and he will teach us all things that we should do. And that includes how to build Zion in this moment, in this space, at this time.